There is a very cruel narrative that settles into the mind of someone who leaves an emotionally draining relationship, the idea of failure. The person looks back and concludes they made mistakes, chose wrong, loved the wrong way, or simply weren't enough. This conclusion doesn't come out of nowhere. It is the direct result of a specific type of bond, where love stopped being an exchange and became exhaustion. You didn't fail at love. You were drained by it. Some relationships are not built on balance. They are built on asymmetry. One side offers presence, care, listening, patience, and constant effort. The other offers intermittent absence, emotional confusion, and still demands endless understanding. The one who truly loves starts adjusting everything within themselves to keep the bond alive, even if it means walking away from who they are. At first, this looks like dedication. It looks like maturity. It looks like love. But over time, the cost becomes clear. You start feeling tired without a clear reason. You begin doubting your own perception. You convince yourself that you're overreacting, asking too much, feeling too much. Slowly, you shrink your needs so you won't be a burden. That's when love stops nourishing and starts draining. Relationships like this don't end suddenly. They empty a person from the inside out. Self-esteem weakens, emotional safety disappears, and identity starts revolving around pleasing, maintaining, saving. You no longer live the relationship, you survive inside it. When it finally ends, the impact is devastating. Not only because you lost the other person, but because you lost yourself. And that's when guilt appears. If only I had done more, if only I had been different, if only I had understood better. This guilt is not a sign of emotional responsibility. It's a sign that you carried a weight that was never meant to be yours alone. Healthy love doesn't require you to disappear. It doesn't ask you to diminish yourself. It doesn't demand that you hurt yourself to prove you care. If you left that relationship feeling empty, confused, and emotionally broken, it doesn't mean you failed. It means you stayed too long trying to sustain something that was silently draining you. Here on Beyond Love, we talk about these dynamics because many good people are blaming themselves for wounds they didn't create. Loving was not the mistake. Staying where only you were holding everything together was the real cost. If this content resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. When did you realize you were losing yourself in the relationship? There is a profound difference between loving someone and surviving inside a relationship. Loving involves exchange, growth, and mutual presence. Surviving, on the other hand, means living in a constant state of emotional alert, trying to anticipate reactions, avoid conflicts, and maintain a stability that never truly exists. Many people only realize they were surviving when the relationship ends, or when their mind and body can no longer take it. When love turns into survival, you begin to measure your words, silence your feelings, and negotiate your own boundaries. Small concessions pile up until they become major sacrifices. You stop expressing discomfort because it's not worth the argument. You stop asking for what you need because it will cause problems. Slowly, the relationship becomes sustained by your silence and your emotional endurance. This dynamic is often mistaken for emotional maturity. You believe you're being understanding, empathetic, patient. But in reality, you're erasing yourself to keep an unstable connection alive. Healthy love allows dialogue and constructive discomfort. Draining love turns any attempt at conversation into a threat of abandonment. When you live in this state, fear becomes a central element of the relationship. Fear of losing the person, fear of being abandoned, fear of sounding dramatic, fear of asking for too much. This fear doesn't exist because you're naturally insecure. It exists because the bond is fragile, unpredictable, and conditional. And the more you try to hold the relationship together, the more it slips away. The more you adapt, the less recognition you receive. Effort stops being appreciated and starts being expected. Your care becomes an obligation. Your devotion becomes the bare minimum. And you start feeling that, no matter how much you give, it's never enough. Emotionally surviving inside a relationship is one of the quietest forms of psychological exhaustion. There are no constant fights or dramatic explosions. There is a daily erosion of self-esteem, spontaneity, and joy. You're still there, but you no longer recognize yourself. This is the moment when love stops being a shelter and becomes an internal battlefield, a place where you fight your own feelings to preserve something that should, by nature, make you feel safe. Recognizing that you were surviving, not loving, is painful, but liberating. Because from that point on, the story changes. You stop seeing yourself as weak or dependent and begin to understand that you were trapped in a dynamic that demanded too much and gave too little. One of the greatest mistakes in draining relationships is believing that emotional exhaustion is part of love. Many people learn, consciously or unconsciously, that loving requires constant sacrifice, endless compromise, and emotional endurance. So when the body begins to show signs of exhaustion, they don't see it as a warning, they see it as proof of commitment. The problem is that love should not leave you exhausted all the time. Yes, it can require effort, but it should not drain you to the point where you lose energy for yourself. When a relationship becomes your main source of stress, anxiety, and emotional depletion, something is deeply misaligned. Emotional exhaustion often appears subtly at first. You wake up already tired. Small conflicts affect you more than they used to. You feel a constant tension in your body, as if you're always preparing for something to go wrong. But instead of questioning the relationship, you question yourself. You think you're too sensitive, too weak, too dependent. This is a dangerous mechanism because it shifts responsibility. Instead of observing the dynamic, you start attacking your own identity. The relationship is no longer examined, you become the problem. And this allows the exhaustion to continue unchecked. In many cases, exhaustion comes from constantly trying to regulate the other person emotionally. You become the mediator, the caretaker, the one who understands everything, the one who always gives in. The relationship starts functioning at the cost of your emotional energy. You hold everything together while the other person allows themselves to fluctuate, disappear, hurt, and return as if nothing happened. Love is not that. That is overload. When you always have to be strong, understanding, available, something is wrong. Healthy relationships allow mutual vulnerability. They allow mistakes, pauses, emotional rest. Draining love turns your sensitivity into an obligation and your empathy into exploitation. The cruelest part of this process is that the more exhausted you become, the harder it is to leave. Exhaustion paralyzes. It confuses. It makes you believe you wouldn't survive starting over, that you don't have the strength to build something different. And so you stay, not out of love, but out of fatigue. Recognizing that what you called love was actually emotional exhaustion is an essential step in rebuilding your story. You weren't weak. You were drained. And no one makes good decisions when they are emotionally depleted. After a draining relationship ends, one of the most persistent emotions is guilt. Not guilt tied to a specific mistake, but a vague feeling that you could have done more, understood better, loved differently. This guilt settles in because, for a long time, you were emotionally trained to take responsibility for everything that went wrong in the relationship. In unbalanced bonds, guilt is rarely distributed fairly. It usually falls on the one who tries harder, cares more, explains more. Every time something went wrong, you reviewed your words, your actions, your reactions. You asked yourself where you failed, while the other person simply moved on without reflection. This pattern doesn't appear overnight. It is built gradually through subtle reversals of responsibility. When you expressed discomfort, the conversation shifted to your tone, your sensitivity, your way of feeling. The focus never stayed on the behavior that caused the pain, but on how you reacted to it. Over time, you learned that feeling was the problem. Eventually, this logic becomes internalized. Even after the relationship ends, you keep blaming yourself. You replay old conversations, relive arguments, create imagined scenarios where everything could have been different if only you had acted better. This mental repetition is not learning. It is self-accusation. Guilt also offers a false sense of control. Believing you were at fault creates the illusion that, had you done something differently, the outcome would have changed. Accepting that the problem lay in the dynamic, not just in you, is more painful, because it means acknowledging limits you could not control. But carrying guilt that was never yours only prolongs the emotional bond to what has already ended. While you punish yourself, the other person moves on freely. While you try to fix yourself, the relationship continues living inside you. It's important to understand, emotional responsibility does not mean carrying everything alone. Responsibility is recognizing your part without carrying the other person's weight. If you asked for dialogue and received silence, sought clarity and received confusion, offered care and received indifference, that is not your failure. Releasing this guilt does not mean denying your mistakes. It means stopping defining yourself by an unfair narrative. You were not the problem. You were in a relationship that taught you to doubt yourself in order to survive. No one enters a relationship expecting to lose themselves. Self-loss does not happen suddenly, nor does it come with a clear warning sign. It happens in layers, almost imperceptibly, while you believe you're simply trying to make things work. That's why, when the relationship ends, many people don't just miss the other person, they feel a deeper emptiness, the absence of themselves. At first, you simply adapt. You adjust schedules, bend preferences, change small routines. It all seems natural, even healthy. Love involves compromise, and you're willing to make it. The problem begins when those compromises are not mutual and start accumulating on only one side. You stop saying what you think to avoid tension. You begin hiding parts of your personality that cause conflict. You give up interests, friendships, habits that once defined you. Not because someone directly forced you to, but because the bond feels too fragile to hold who you truly are. Gradually, you stop asking yourself how you feel and start asking what the other person expects. Your internal compass shifts direction. Your decisions no longer come from desire, but from the attempt to maintain balance. And when you live like this long enough, you lose track of what is spontaneous and what is forced adaptation. This loss is not only emotional. It is identity-based. You look in the mirror and realize you're different, but you can't quite explain why. You feel less alive, less creative, less confident. Things that once brought you joy lose their color. Life becomes narrower, revolving around the relationship. The most painful part is that while you fade, you believe you're maturing. You confuse silence with balance, lack of conflict with harmony, self-censorship with love. And you only recognize the cost when the relationship has already drained you too deeply to remember who you used to be. Losing yourself in a relationship is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign that you stayed too long in a space that could not hold your wholeness. No healthy relationship requires you to fragment yourself to fit. Rebuilding begins when you acknowledge this loss without judgment. You didn't lose yourself because you wanted to. You lost yourself trying to love, trying to maintain, trying to hold something together that could not exist without your constant sacrifice. Many people ask themselves, after everything ends, why they stayed so long in a relationship that clearly hurt them. This question often comes loaded with shame and self-criticism, as if staying were proof of weakness or emotional dependence. But the truth is that leaving a draining relationship is not simple, because it doesn't trap you through constant suffering, but through confusion. Draining relationships are rarely bad all the time. They alternate pain with moments of intense closeness, promises, reconnections, and hope. This emotional fluctuation creates a powerful cycle, where the brain learns to wait for the next improvement. You don't stay because of what is consistent, but because of what might return. There is also emotional investment. The more you give, the harder it becomes to accept that it won't change. You don't want to believe that all the effort, patience, and love were placed into something without a solid foundation. Leaving, in this context, feels like admitting a loss that's too big to face. Another crucial factor is the gradual erosion of your trust in yourself. Over time, you learn to doubt your own perceptions. When something hurt, you were led to believe you were overreacting. When you felt confused, you assumed the problem was your sensitivity. So even when the desire to leave appeared, it came with doubt. What if I'm giving up too soon? There is also fear of emptiness. When the relationship occupies most of your emotional space, imagining life without it brings anxiety. Not because the relationship was healthy, but because it became central. You no longer know who you are outside that bond, and that uncertainty paralyzes you. Attachment to the idealized version of the other person also plays a role. You are connected not only to who they are, but to who they were at certain moments and who you believe they could become. Leaving means abandoning that image, that promise, that future you imagined together. None of this is weakness. These are human responses to unstable and emotionally intense bonds. Understanding why it was hard to leave is not about justifying yourself, it's about understanding yourself. And understanding is the first step toward not repeating the same pattern in the future. You didn't stay because you lacked self-respect. You stayed because you believed, hoped, and tried. The problem wasn't trying too much. It was staying in something that demanded more and more from you while giving less and less in return. Even when a relationship that emotionally drained you comes to an end, its effects don't disappear immediately. In fact, some of the deepest marks only become visible afterward. When the other person is no longer present, the impact reveals itself in how you feel, think, and relate to yourself and the world. One of the first signs is difficulty trusting, not only others, but your own perception. You start questioning your feelings, reactions, and intuition. Whenever something bothers you, doubt appears. Am I overreacting again? This insecurity wasn't born with you. It was built inside a bond that repeatedly invalidated what you felt. Another common effect is emotional hypervigilance. You become overly alert to signs of distance, tone changes, or small communication gaps. Your body learned that love can be unstable and that any slip might mean abandonment. Even in neutral situations, your emotional system stays on guard. There is also emotional fatigue. The idea of getting involved again creates more exhaustion than excitement. Not because you don't believe in love, but because you associate connection with depletion. Intimacy begins to feel dangerous, as if loving always means losing a part of yourself. Additionally, many carry a persistent sense of inadequacy. A feeling that something about you is either too much or not enough. That loving the way you love causes problems. This belief is especially cruel because it turns a strength, the ability to feel deeply, into a flaw. These impacts are invisible because, on the outside, you may appear fine. Life goes on, and people assume you've moved on. But internally, there is a quiet process of rebuilding that often goes unrecognized and unvalidated. Ignoring these marks doesn't make them disappear. Instead, they tend to repeat themselves in new relationships, with new people, but following the same internal logic. That's why looking at this impact isn't about staying stuck in the past. It's about breaking a cycle. The end of a relationship that drained you doesn't mean the end of the damage. But it also doesn't mean you're doomed to repeat the story. Recognizing these wounds is the beginning of healing, not to become more closed off, but to become more aware. Not all pain exists to teach a lesson, but every experience leaves marks that can be understood. A relationship that emotionally drained you was not a complete waste, even though it came at a high cost. It revealed limits you may never have been forced to see, needs you ignored, and patterns quietly repeating in the way you love. One of the first lessons is about boundaries. You often realize, too late, that loving without limits is not unconditional love, it's self-erasure. When you accept everything, tolerate everything, and adapt to everything, the other person doesn't learn to respect you. They simply learn that you will always stay, regardless of the cost. This experience also exposes the difference between empathy and self-abandonment. Empathy is understanding the other without losing yourself. Self-abandonment is justifying everything while hurting yourself. In draining relationships, you become an expert at understanding others and emotionally illiterate with yourself. Another important lesson is about reciprocity. Love is not about isolated intensity, but about mutual response. Feeling deeply is not enough if the other person doesn't sustain the bond with presence, responsibility, and clarity. You can love intensely and still be in a shallow relationship. The experience also highlights the importance of emotional safety. Not perfect safety, but the minimum predictability that allows you to relax. Relationships that keep you in constant alert are not challenging, they are exhausting. Love should not feel like an ongoing test of emotional endurance. Perhaps the hardest lesson is accepting that effort does not guarantee results. You can do everything right and still not be loved in the way you need. That doesn't diminish your value. It only shows that not every connection becomes a healthy bond. Understanding these lessons is not about romanticizing pain or justifying what hurt you. It's about extracting meaning so the experience doesn't repeat automatically. When you integrate the learning, you stop carrying an open wound and start carrying awareness. This experience didn't break you. It showed you how far you're willing to go for love. Now the choice is learning to go that far for someone who is also walking toward you. After an experience where love drained more than it nourished, the idea of opening up again can feel distant, risky, or even impossible. Rebuilding your relationship with love does not mean jumping into a new connection quickly or proving to yourself that you've moved on. It means, above all, redefining what love now means to you. The first step in this rebuilding is separating love from suffering. For a long time, you learned that loving required enduring, insisting, and holding on. Now, you must unlearn that association. Love does not need to hurt to be real. It does not need to confuse to be deep. It does not need to drain to be intense. Rebuilding also involves reclaiming your inner listening. After so long prioritizing the other, you must relearn how to listen to your own signals. Fatigue, discomfort, anxiety, and inner silence are not weaknesses, they are information. Ignoring them repeats the pattern. Honoring them changes the story. In this process, boundaries stop being walls and become filters. They don't push love away, they only push away what cannot sustain it. Saying no, pausing, questioning, and standing your ground are not threats to the right bond. They are guarantees that it will be healthy. It's also necessary to reassess the type of person you associate with love. Often, you confuse intensity with connection, mystery with depth, instability with passion. Rebuilding means learning to feel safe without feeling bored, and involved without feeling at risk. This new relationship with love is more conscious and less impulsive. It doesn't arise from lack, but from choice. It doesn't seek to fill voids, but to share presence. And for that very reason, it may feel less overwhelming at first. But that's exactly where its strength lies. Rebuilding is not about returning to who you were before the pain. It's about becoming someone who understands their worth and no longer negotiates their emotional integrity. Healthy love does not require you to lose yourself in order to exist. Reaching the end of this story doesn't mean everything is resolved, nor that the pain has completely disappeared. It means you went through something difficult and came out alive on the other side. Many people fail to recognize this in themselves. They focus on what they lost, but not on what they endured. They see the ending, but not the resilience. You didn't fail at love. You survived a dynamic that demanded too much, offered too little, and still made you believe the fault was yours. Surviving, in this context, is no small thing. It's proof of emotional strength, even if that strength was used to endure rather than to choose. Perhaps today you are more cautious, more selective, less willing to give yourself impulsively. That's not emotional closure. That's maturity built from pain. You didn't lose your ability to love. You gained awareness of how you no longer want to love. The love that is worth it doesn't ask for constant sacrifice or keep you doubting your worth. It doesn't require you to hurt yourself to prove loyalty. It doesn't drain you until you forget who you are. Healthy love is a place of emotional rest, not survival. The end of that relationship does not define who you are. It doesn't erase your capacity to feel deeply, to care, to connect. It simply marks the moment you began to understand that love shouldn't hurt like that. If there's one thing to take with you, it's this: you don't need to become less sensitive to protect yourself. You only need to learn where, with whom, and how far to give yourself. The problem was never loving too much. It was loving alone for too long. From now on, may love be something that supports you, not something you endure. Something that builds you, not breaks you. You didn't fail at love. You survived, and now you can choose differently.